my perception of my childhood, or my feeling throughout my childhood, was I was very guarded and very introverted, and just tried to stay invisible, actually, was how I felt. Like I didn't want to be seen, I didn't want to be heard. I already had a boyfriend, and I thought, I just want to get married and have a family and hide in my house. And I was a mum at home with our first daughter, and I remember being a little disappointed in myself because I thought, this was meant to feel different. I thought being this would feel better. At the time, my husband had died, I had a mortgage, I had 2 youngsters, I had no career or income. I was on a single parent's pension, no money behind me, and I had no idea. We all think we know where our life is sort of headed. And when that happened, it was just like this hammer came down, and I thought it was all just black. I do remember, feeling quite numb. I remember very clearly my last words were, "This is not what I wanted for my life." And as I took a breath, the almost audible words in my head were, "What do you want?" What? Like, what do I want? And I thought, I've never thought about that. I've been so busy. I felt like I'd been so busy protecting myself and shielding myself and batting things and just trying to navigate life and please people. I'd never thought about what I wanted.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Life Abundant podcast. My name's Kimmy and this is Di from DiLive. Today we're going to be talking about Di's story. And the interesting twist on this episode is that I am Di's daughter. So we get to talk about Di's life and all of the lessons she's learnt throughout it. And I get to interact with her on those little pieces of knowledge that she has accumulated. And we get to talk about some of the really juicy stuff in her life. So my first question for you, Di, is obviously where everybody starts, which is your childhood. Yeah. So everybody kind of has different childhoods, but often we have different perceptions of our childhoods. Like I'm sure that if we asked your mum, who has now passed away, what her perception of your childhood, it would be really different to what yours was. But I would love to hear, how did you perceive your childhood? How did you feel as a child when you were growing up?
Yes, that is where it all starts, isn't it? And I like what you just said, because even my brothers and sisters have a different view of our childhood. For me, I was very shy, very insecure, very withdrawn, quiet. And I remember Mum introducing me like that, like, Princess Di, she's really shy. Yeah. And so I grew up knowing that I was really shy. And I was. My perception of my childhood, or my feeling throughout my childhood, was I was very guarded and very introverted, and just tried to stay invisible, actually, was how I felt. Like I didn't want to be seen, I didn't want to be heard. I'd have my head down all the time. All of my photos in my childhood were, I had longer hair and I just wanted to hide. I was stooped. Yeah. So that was me. And I was very intelligent, as in I loved studying at school, but I didn't like the social interaction. I didn't fare very well at school socially. Yeah. So I was quite, again, a bit of an outcast, I guess, a bit of a loner, and was happy to do the work but not happy to do the social stuff. And so I didn't actually go to university. My poor dad, he was, I was a straight A student and found it very easy intellectually, but not socially. And so there was no way I was going to go to university, because everyone said, it's a great time, and I thought, that sounds awful. Yeah. So I got a job in the bank, and before mid-year exams in year 12, and Dad was pretty devastated. Yeah, because you didn't finish school, and he obviously saw lots of potential in your intelligence, and he wanted you to take that further. Be a doctor, or, and I just had no aspirations whatsoever. I just wanted to hide, actually. Yeah. So I already had a boyfriend, and I thought, I just want to get married and have a family and hide in my house. Do you think you have an idea of what some of the core things were that kind of stripped you of your confidence almost? Like you came from quite a big family. There was 4 of you, so like 4 kids, and so it's not like it was siblings. A small
small
Yeah, it
family.
was
There was a
my-
lot of you.
Yeah, it was my individual experience
Yeah.
of things that happened, I would have said, to me as a child
Yeah.
and throughout my childhood. And it really shaped my perception of the outside world.
Yeah.
And I see that now. But at the time, it was, life was coming at me and I was very much a victim mentality
Yeah, fair
throughout my
enough.
childhood. So
Yeah.
very defensive.
Yeah.
Lots of, but at the same time, I didn't, I would have said my childhood was a little interrupted, my development was a little interrupted
Yeah,
by what
sure.
was happening. And so I didn't actually learn good boundaries either. So I was very mixed up in my whole self
Yeah, that
identity,
makes a lot of sense.
I
Yeah,
think you'd say.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So you worked at the bank
Yes.
before you even finished school.
Well,
It was
yeah,
like
as
halfway
I-
through year 12, right?
Yeah, I
Yep.
applied for the job and I got the job, which was great. I was
Yeah.
determined to do that. There was a position going
Yep.
in Whaler, which was high unemployment at the time. So
You grew up in Wales, didn't you?
yeah.
Yep.
And so high unemployment, and I thought if I can just get a job before the school leaver wave
Yes, yeah.
starts, and so that's what I did.
Yep.
My maths teacher, beautiful Mr. Girdham, who's now no longer with us,
No.
he was devastated because he
Yeah.
had tickets on me to be dux of the school and all
Yep.
of that, and I just walked in one day and said I want my leaver statement, and he was
Yep.
really upset.
Yep.
But I never wavered. Like I just knew
Yeah, that's what you wanted to
what
do.
I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't too long after that you actually got married to your quite long time boyfriend. You guys had lived together since you were 15, is that
Yeah,
right?
16, yeah.
Yep. So you got married at how old?
I got engaged on my 18th birthday
Yeah.
and married. I had my honeymoon. I was on my honeymoon when I turned 19.
Yeah, wow.
So, and my husband was 9.5 years older than
Yep.
me.
Yep.
So, that made a lot of sense. It was funny going back to my maths teacher. He said to me, "Oh my goodness, how long are you going to, do that? Like get a job in the bank until what? You get married and have kids?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he was just like
6
serious.
months later.
And yeah, and I was
Yeah.
actually pregnant with my first daughter, and I bumped into him in the supermarket.
Yeah,
and he just,
wow.
The look on his face said it all. Like, oh God.
Yeah. So you were married quite early on
Mm-hmm.
and got into just like a general adult life quite early on.
Yeah.
And so you had 2 kids with your first husband,
Yes.
and that was me and my older sister.
Yes. Yes.
And we've spoken before about Dad, and he was a lovely, beautiful man, and you guys had a lovely and beautiful relationship. But in yourself, in those first few years of marriage and motherhood, what was your perception of your life? How did you feel about yourself and your life? I guess almost in contrast to how you felt about childhood.
Yeah, it's interesting, that question, because I remember getting married, of course, and then I was a home wife and I was only like 6 months and then I was pregnant with my
Yeah.
first child. And as life ticked along, well, we had a few interruptions in that my husband straight away, we got married, came back from a honeymoon, and he had heart surgery to replace some heart valves.
Yeah.
So that was a big thing just
Yeah,
after we'd gotten
massive.
married, and we had no children at that point. And then life sort of started to get back to normal, and I was a mum at home with our first daughter, and I remember being a little disappointed in myself because I thought, oh, this was meant to feel different. I
Yeah.
thought being this would feel better. And so I started reading some books on, how to be a better wife, how to be a better partner,
Yeah, wow.
I wanted to feel better and be better. And I always turned it back on myself, like, you're not doing well enough. There's something you've got to do better to
Yeah.
make your life better. And I
Yeah.
was scrambling around trying to figure that out. I enjoyed my alone time and
Yeah.
then with my children. So I
Yeah.
was building that, and I was a very dedicated wife, very submissive, I would have said.
Yep.
Just trying to make everyone's life
Yeah.
happy.
Yeah.
But in myself, I kept being very aware that I don't feel that happy.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Like the satisfaction you kind of expected to receive in being a wife and being a mother kind of wasn't there, which wasn't to say that you didn't, love your kids and love your husband, but just,
Yeah.
there's that inner satisfaction of like,
Yeah.
do I feel like I'm being my best self right now?
That's right.
And it's interesting that you talk about that you would like dig into books onto how to improve those kinds of things, because obviously that, ability to study, that was a school thing for you. Like you
Yeah.
were able to do that really well in school. And so it's almost like you took that into your adult life with your life problems of like, if I study more, maybe
Yes.
this can,
Like there's an
work
answer out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I think is true. Like if you look for an answer hard enough, then you can find it, but it's not always someone else's version of it. It's
Well, I
often
think
what's in us.
what you've just said is revealed further in our conversation, in my story, because right from the beginning, I was looking for the answer.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting where I found it.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously I know your story, and I know that you lost your husband quite early on as a young adult, and you had 2 children at that point. Your husband was your primary source of income. And so when he passed away, you also lost a primary source of income. And that's all a lot of stuff to happen all in one go. And so that's a pretty pivotal moment in your life when everything kind of comes crashing down around you. But I remember you speaking about a specific incident that made you kind of go, okay, things have to change. So can you tell me about that moment that you had, and in that turmoil of losing your husband, your income, having 2 young kids, being a single parent, how that changed the trajectory for you?
It's amazing, with where I'm at now and what I know now about life and us, how we operate as human beings. And I look back then, and it does bring a smile to my face watching it in my memory, because at the time, yes, my husband had died. I was there living in the mid-north of South Australia. I had a very old car, 20-year-old car. I had a mortgage. I had 2 youngsters. I had no career or income. I was on a single parent's pension, no money behind me. And I had no idea, after he died, it was almost like, we all think we know where our life is sort of headed.
Yeah.
And when that happened, it was just like this hammer came down, and I thought it was all just black. I couldn't see, I had no plans. I had no idea. All I knew was what I had, which wasn't a lot. You and your sister were and I do remember, feeling quite numb, as most people do when they have a loss of someone very close to them.
Yeah, definitely.
And I was sort of in this bubble. However, I didn't have any children at school. I didn't have a job to go to. It was just us in our house. I had friends, but one in particular that really was my lifeline.
Yeah.
This beautiful woman who and still continues to be a dear friend. And she was checking in on me, if not every day, every second day. So I saw the outside world.
Yeah.
Because I really was quite insular even then.
Yeah.
And I just, as I look back, I was very baseline emotionally. So it was almost like my husband died, and that took me down. But I just sort of thought, well, that's my life.
Yeah.
I'd never been very excited about much in life.
Yeah.
So I was pretty shut down emotionally. So I sort of continued on that trajectory. And I look back and I think, I had a bit of a, what you'd call a bit of a resolve that I can get through anything, because I felt like that's how I'd lived, like I can endure this. And so I was going along, but I wasn't aware until this event happened how shut down I was. And so my first daughter, your sister, as you know, is a bit of a sunshine character. Like, she just gets excited about the smallest of things and is a really high-spirited. And on this day, so I had both my children still in nappies. We had quite a time of it. And so she was nearing 3 and was still in nappies. And anyway, I was trying to get her dressed on this day and helping her with something, and she wasn't cooperating. She was just not cooperating. And now, in the past, I'd been just so level.
Yeah.
She would not have expected of me to have reacted in any way.
Yeah, interesting.
Right?
Okay.
And on this day, and in fact, let's go back a couple of days, I remember doing the chores, washing. It was cloth nappies back then, so I had nappies coming out of every space in the house. They were either to be washed on the line or in a chair. And on this day, I just remember feeling the emotion stirring in me about my discontent with my life.
Yeah.
And I remember the thought that, I've got to keep this in, because if this ever sees the light of day, I'm in deep trouble.
Okay.
Like, it's just going to... So I was aware of that. Well, on this day, my beautiful, nearly 3-year-old daughter, I was just like, will you just cooperate with me? And she dropped her hands and her feet, and she just looked at me, and she's got these big brown eyes, and she just locked me in with those. And she almost spat the words. This is my recollection of it.
Yeah.
The words were, "I just want my daddy."
Yes.
And just those words. And I'll tell you how that frame was for me. I was sitting on the floor. She said the words, and it was like a wrecking ball came through.
Yeah.
And I felt winded, and at the same time picked myself up.
Yeah.
And I raced down the passage because I could feel the emotion just coming.
Bubbling up,
like a volcano.
Yeah.
And so I ran down the passage because I thought, I don't really know. I didn't think, actually. I just ran down the passage. And I got to the end of the passage where the little nursery was. And I slammed the door, and we were living in this little 5-row house. I felt like the thing shook. I was furious. And I stood in the middle of the room with my hands on my hips. I mean, it's just me there.
Yeah.
And the girls were down in the other room. And I just stood there like this, and I looked up at the ceiling, and I just said so many things. I just let out all this frustration. I won't sort of repeat the language, but it was just everything came out. And I was so angry, angry. And I was addressing God as if he was sitting on my roof and blaming him and saying, this is a mess and it's not my fault. And after I'd finished at the end of my rant, I remember very clearly my last words were, this is not what I wanted for my life.
Yeah.
And I was sort of, took a breath. And as I took a breath, the almost audible words in my head were, what do you want? And that stopped me in my tracks. And even to this day, I so remember how I felt. I was like, what? Like, what do I want? And I thought, I've never thought about that. I've been so busy. I felt like I'd been so busy protecting myself and shielding myself and batting things and just trying to navigate life and please people. I'd never thought about what I wanted. I mean, I guess I knew I'd wanted to get married, but now that was done.
Yeah.
I had no other plan.
Yeah.
And so what was interesting was in that moment, and I guess for those of you listening to this, the thing to note was I'd let out a whole lot of emotion in that moment. I was so angry I couldn't even cry.
Yeah.
I was very angry. And as I let that out, and then this question came, what do you want? And I just started saying, oh, what do I want? And as I walked back down the passage, and this part makes me laugh a little bit because I don't know how long that time was that I was down there ranting. But as I walked back down the passage and I had my head down, I remember walking back down the passage and thinking, this is what I want. If you're asking, this is what I want. I want a really good life for these two. I want to be the best mum and the best dad. That was me. I was going to do this on my own and get it right and, setting myself up for this grand life that I was going to deliver. And I often say to people, if you'd been there and you knew my whole situation, you might have been running alongside of me going, but you've got nothing, like you've got no money, you've got no degrees, you've got no career, you've got nothing, how are you going to do this? But that wasn't in my mind at the time. I was really super focused, and it would have been funny from your perspective. I mean, you were only, goodness, you would have only been 2 months, something like, you were 3 months when your dad died, so you would have been 3-4 months maybe. So you were just there. And my other daughter would have been there. And I don't know what she thought as I came back because I was very different coming back down the passage to what I was when I left. And I was calm and I was very thoughtful. And that, to me, is the moment, like that thought of what do you want? And I thought, wow.
Yeah, it's like it opened up a portal of actually being able to dream and think about what you like for your life.
And I felt different. I felt this energy in me that I just thought, whoa. And that stayed with me. And I have to say that fire in my belly is still there. And that was the beginning of me starting to actually, get a fire in my belly and say, come on. And what I realised, I think, in that moment was when my daughter said, I just want my daddy, what that translated to for me was, if you're not going to show up, bring someone in who will. Because he was definitely, he was fun, he was lighthearted, and I was not at all. So
yeah, definitely.
That's where I decided, okay, things are going to change.
And I need to show up in my own life. So that's obviously a pretty pivotal moment for yourself, for your, in your mind. So from that point, you've obviously had this kind of revelation of like, what do I want? I need to start thinking about what I want in my life. And I need to show up for myself and for my kids and, actually be present. So how did that then change the trajectory of the years to come? Because, obviously your life kept going. It didn't just stop there. No. It kept going. And so how did that change the way that you then proceeded to do the rest of your life?
It's funny, isn't it? I was only thinking this morning how growth happens, and like I've watched you grow from a baby into who you are, and I haven't ever noticed the growth, but clearly it's happened.
Yeah.
And so I think what changed for me that day was, like you said, an opening up and an awareness of myself that I get to choose.
Yeah.
And I guess I wasn't convinced of that at that point, but I liked the sound of it. And so what I found from that point on was me being very aware of how I was showing up due to what my daughter had said, like how am I showing up? And I started to become aware of when people would ask things of me or just, you know, sort of expect things of me, how I felt. And I'd start to notice that actually I don't really want that, but I find myself doing it. So that was a pretty slow move in the right direction to where I am now. I mean, it's very, very different in me now. But I do know that I did start to be very deliberate and notice what I wanted. Even if I wasn't actually acting into that at the time, I became very, more in my life, I guess.
And it's interesting. I actually want to interject here and, you know, and talk about, I guess, what I've seen as far as, you know, like obviously my whole life and my whole story is a whole different thing. But what I saw in my childhood was, like, you know, you got remarried, right? So when we were younger, when we were still quite young, you got remarried, you started a business, you know, we were really well looked after as kids. Like, we were a very privileged family. And it's interesting how what you kind of said to yourself all those years ago, I want to, you know, provide for these kids. I want these girls to have a good life. And you started making some decisions about what kind of life you wanted, like what you actually wanted for yourself. And obviously I can't speak to whether or not your, you know, the years following that was exactly as you envisioned. Probably not. It kind of never really is for anyone, is it? Like, you know, desires and things change as we grow. But from what you're talking about, where you were at, this person with so much pent up feelings and anger, so much trauma contributing to all of that, and feeling like you just had nothing. And then our life, you know, that I saw as a kid, we were really privileged. So a lot of that did come to life. A lot of your, I guess, wants of, you know, being able to provide for your family and being able to, you know, have a life that actually, where you were present and, you know, contributing to, you know, everything that existed from my perspective, which again, it would have been a different experience for you on multiple different levels. But I know for me, I grew up being very provided for and very privileged, very well looked after. You know, you were very present in my life. You were not an absent parent by any stretch of the imagination. Granted, you were juggling a lot of things, you know, mothering, business, you know, any other facet of thing. And so, you know, I'm sure that was a really stressful period of your life, but you did it really well. And I think, you know, those things that you kind of started dreaming about, a lot of them seems like they did come to light.
Yeah, I think what you say is true. I really felt like I wanted to grab life with both hands, which I did. And I did marry very shortly after, like it was very quick for me. And, you know, the beautiful man that took me and my two children on was a big part of the abundance that we then experienced. We worked well together in building a business, which we started quite early on.
Yes, definitely.
And yeah, I did want to be a great mum, really know my children, you know, a great wife, then business partner, which hadn't been in my view, but that really grew me. And I think those years, you know, I did feel deeply satisfied with what I was doing. However, I was still reminded frequently of this insecurity deep inside of me and this shame. I guess the overriding emotions for me were always never good enough. A lot of shame and blame, self-directed. Like if anything ever went wrong, it was my fault. And I could be very creative in that. It may have been over here with nothing to do with me, but it was my fault. And so I carried heavily those things. And I can absolutely say without a shadow of a doubt, attributing that to me and my earlier life. And so, you know, I loved and still do love being a mum and a grandmother. love family and business. I love people, which was something that really emerged for me because I'd come from a place of being so shy and so afraid and no boundaries to really just understanding, oh my goodness, this life has so much to offer, and I really wanted to do it all. And as a child of mine, you would have seen me probably take on too many things at stages. But my dad used to say, and he was a beautiful man, he would say, live every day as if it's your life, your last, and live life fully. And I thought, I watched him do the best.
You definitely did
that. And I did the same. And so, it was a funny energy split in a way because I loved this.
Yeah.
But there was this...
You'd found satisfaction in a lot of life, but you hadn't actually found full satisfaction in yourself. Yeah.
Not at all.
So that is an excellent segue to my next question, which is that obviously, life changes, things happen. And so you had this really, what looked like a really excellent life from the outside for many, many years. It was 25, 30 years.
23 years,
And then there was another pivotal moment for you that actually brought you to another kind of rock bottom in your life. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think just a little thing I want to add before I go there, so remind me in a minute, but during those years, I had a friend from the mid-north who also had 2 girls, and early on in my second marriage, the news came through that she had taken her own life.
Wow.
And so a part of the years that led, right to where you're speaking to now, a part of those was that I had stuff in my childhood that I just had accepted and thought, well, this is the way it is.
Yeah.
And when my friend took her own life and one of her daughters found her, and I watched the carnage that followed, it hit me so hard, and because I knew that she had a very similar childhood to me. And it had obviously gotten to a point where she just couldn't deal with it. And I knew how I was feeling, and I thought, I don't want that.
Yep.
And knowing her, she was such a charismatic... If you'd met her, you would have thought she'd be the last person to do that.
Yeah.
So it really struck me.
Yeah.
And so I had, during those early years of my mothering, gone to talk to, counsellors and psychologists and people about my past and how to deal with it better, or what did I need to do to, not have that be the outcome.
Yeah.
So I'd done that, and I'd started a lot of self-development in that time and growing a business, starting to lead people, which was not what I thought I was.
Yeah, totally opposite from what we started out doing.
So I went to get help, and again, reading and listening and looking for programs that would help me grow. So I had a lot of change in that time. And again, really grateful to the man who was my husband, who provided a very stable environment for me to do the rocky stuff. Because without that, I don't know if I ever would have. I was grateful for that. And then 23 years in, all my girls had left home and I was struggling inside. And I don't know how much anyone really realised. A lot of people were very surprised at the outcome and said, we thought everything was fine. But I started losing weight, so I lost about 10 kilo, and I was having panic attacks, which I'd never told anybody about. I didn't even know what they were initially. I thought I had a heart problem or whatever, but it started to become very obvious. And my youngest daughter, your sister, approached me one day and said to me, "What are you going to do, Mum? Just stay here and die?" After
Your youngest daughter kind of said, how long are you going to do this? You're going to stay here and die. There was obviously a series of events that followed that, and your marriage ended.
Yes.
And so how did that feel in comparison to losing your husband, which is also a massively big traumatic event? You've got this other massive big traumatic event that's also happened.
Very different in the sense that I had learnt, I thought, a lot in that time, in between those two events. And I thought I was different. And I would have said my life looked different. But what emerged for me at that time was it felt worse than losing my husband to death, because I felt like I was to blame for the breakdown.
It was easier to blame yourself for that than it is to blame yourself for the death of the person.
It wasn't a God event. It was we've made a decision. And I felt like a real failure, because in my whole life of what do you want, it's like I want family, I want
Yeah.
you know, that family
that was really
unit.
important to you.
So yeah, that was a big fall for me.
Yeah.
However, from that place, I mean, that time directly afterwards, I learnt again a lot. It would have been the lowest point I would have said of my life. My children had left home. I was living on my own for the very first time ever. Because when I was widowed, I had you and your sister with me. So it felt completely raw. And again, I was in a business, you know, with my now ex-husband, and again was realising that, I'm actually not doing what I want as much as I enjoyed my life, and I love challenges and all the rest, but was it my heart's desire to be doing what I was doing? No.
Definitely.
And so it took me 2 years to come to the final realisation that, okay, well, I better go back to the
do what I want to do,
and figure out. And I think that day, I still remember the date, and I was standing in my little kitchen of my little apartment, and I thought, okay, so I've got to try and get a handle on living my life. And I remember thinking, okay, to live my life, I have to know a little bit more about me.
Yeah.
Like, who am I? What do I want? And so I actually typed into my Google search, as you do, living authentically.
Yeah.
I didn't know where else to start. I just thought, okay, well, what can I find out? I always turn to the knowledge, like what knowledge is there out there on this? And interestingly, YouTube popped up, and there were, as YouTube is, there was a number of things you could click on. And the one that caught my eye was a frame of an old man, very grey, and he had a flip chart and a texter. And my inner conversation went something like, what does this old dude know about living authentically? Well, I guess he's still alive. He must know something. So I clicked on it, and I didn't know who this gentleman was, but as he spoke, it was like it cut right through. And I thought, I need to hear more of that. And so I actually binged on him everything I could find. For the next, it would have only been 24, 36 hours. And then I sent my information off because he was saying he could teach people. And at the time, I was aware that, okay, my career, I think, is going to be in helping people. And I remember saying to my beautiful accountant, I think I'm going to be a coach. And he's like, okay, I think that's a good idea. I said, my life is a train wreck. Like, what makes me think I can be a coach? He goes, that's exactly why you'll be a great coach.
It's interesting because I feel like quite recently, I've said to you that this is what, like, you've done this throughout your entire life just naturally. Like, I grew up with people, you know, my age and a little bit older. We had young adult kind of groups being part of church and stuff. And you were always the person that they would go to for advice on things. And you were always helping people. You know, we definitely joke sometimes as your daughters that, you know, sometimes we have to be like, okay, we want mum for a second instead of coach for a second. Like, sometimes we just want you to listen to us, you know, blabber about whatever it is going on instead of giving advice. But it's a good problem to have. But, you know, you've been that person throughout the whole time I've known you. You know, my whole life, you've always been an advice giver, someone who's wanted to help people and love on people. And it's part of who you are, which is so interesting because I don't think you would have ever defined yourself as that back in Port Augusta, you know, when you'd lost your husband.
And I think you're onto something there in the sense that, to me, in my mind, it's like, okay, if this is broken or not working, I'm not going to just sit here. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to find a solution. And so as I listened to this man, and I thought, okay, and like I said, a few weeks before, I thought, I think I'm going to be a coach. And I didn't know what type of coach. I didn't like the term life coach because I thought it's your life. You know how to live it. And I remember thinking, I don't want to just be giving people advice and saying, well, this worked for me. I hope it works for you. I wanted to look at people in the eye and say, I know this will work for you. So I, in my mind, knew I needed a framework. I was looking for a framework that was proven. And as things happen, the man I'd stumbled across on YouTube, he had just that. And he spoke about it in one of the things I heard him speak about. So I sent my information, had the call with one of his team. Parted with a lot of money that I didn't have. I remember putting it on like payment plan and credit card and just saying, I'm doing this.
Just committing to your...
I did.
To yourself, basically.
And I actually didn't ask anyone. I remember telling, again, my ex-partner and saying, I'm going to do this. And as he mostly always was, he was just like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
cool. I thought,
Good on you.
off I go.
And I feel like I do remember, again, speaking from my own experience, I know when you kind of told a lot of us about it, like the family about it, we were all a bit like, okay, like,
Yeah.
what is that going to look like? But
Yeah.
all of us can attest to how much it's changed your life doing this work for yourself. And it's changed my life, you know, like my family, my husband, my kids, we're in a different place because of, you know, starting to do this work and actually take on some of this stuff that you now teach people. And all those years ago, you stepped into it out of, you know, trust and need of like, I just need something different in my life. I need something that's actually going to work.
Yeah.
It's
I remember
incredible.
standing there in the kitchen that morning and saying, you know, as intellectual as I was and as much information as I had, I thought my way is clearly not working. What am I missing? Like there must be something I'm missing.
Yeah.
And that's what I learned when I started studying with, and it was Mr. Bob Proctor, who's no longer with us. And I look at and think, wow, I slid into his life in the last 6 years of his life.
Yeah.
I became a very good and close friend with him in the last 3 years of his life.
Yeah, which not everyone does. Like people who study with him, you know, not everyone gets to actually be with him.
I'll be eternally grateful for COVID because that saw me spend one-on-one time with him for over a period of 10 months in Canada, in his home, in his office there.
Wow.
And he gave me so much. And it's funny when you say it's changed your life because back at that time in 2020, I was very committed to doing it and I was feeling the pull from many of my friends and family back in Australia saying, you know, God, you're changing so rapidly. What are you doing? Is it a cult? You know, what's happening? And I remember Bob, I was at his 85th birthday celebrations and his family were there and his brother stood up and said, you know, Bob, when you started this work, we all knew you were a loser and none of us really wanted a bar of you and what you were doing, but you kept on going and then we started to get interested and his brother stood there and said, and now my whole family and my children and my grandchildren are all living the life they are because of what you did. And I remember sitting there and crying and thinking, I want that.
Yeah.
How cool would that be? And it just inspired me more.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, for those of you who are watching, our next episode is actually going to be my story, which is quite tied in with Di and her work and her story because, you know, you had 3 children and out of all 3 of them, our relationship was the most challenging one for both of us. And so there's a lot in that. And we, you know, there's been points in both of our lives where we've both kind of gone, I don't know if this is going to come good. I don't know if we're ever going to have a good relationship. And, you know, now I'm working with you. Like, that's not something I ever saw happening. And, like, our relationship was kind of at the point where it was like, I can do family events with you and I can ring you and talk to you on the phone and that's fine. But that was it. We couldn't go any deeper than that. There was too much stuff. And now we are working together. We have this really open and beautiful relationship. And that wouldn't have been possible without the work that you've done on yourself and the work that I'm beginning to do on myself.
And do you know that, you know, there are a lot of people doing what I do in various ways and there are a lot of different sorts of coaches and many of them are talking about becoming millionaires and the money and all of that.
Yeah.
And I remember flying it was actually the weekend of Bob's birthday and so he had it in Vegas and he put all of us up in this beautiful hotel in Vegas and he was insistent. I was heading to the gym one morning and my then partner was having a meeting with Bob and I went and said good morning and he said, come with us. And I said, no, you have your meeting. I was in my gym gear. I'm like, I'm going to the gym. And he's like, no, come for breakfast. I'm like, no, it's all fine. I insisted, no, I'm going. And then he goes, come to breakfast. I'm like, okay, I'm going for breakfast. So I went into this beautiful restaurant there in my gym gear. They had their meeting and then he turned to me and he said, and on the plane over to this event was quite a pivotal time in my relationship. And I remember thinking, oh, how would Bob deal with this?
Yeah.
And at that breakfast, and I never would have asked him about it, that was not where I was at. And at this breakfast, he said, so what do your family think about you gallivanting around the world? And I said, mostly they're happy. He said, who's not happy? And then we
It
got
was
into the
me.
conversation, which I'll share in the next episode.
yeah.
But what he told me to do in that conversation, I remember sitting there and thinking, Bob, you don't know what you're dealing with here. Like this isn't going to work. However, I did what he said, and the result is I get quite emotional.
I still don't know what he said, but I could obviously, I'm sitting
You're
here
about to
now.
find
Like
out.
our next episode is going to be my story, and not just our story together, but my story as an individual, which is also quite eventful. You know, we share that in common, that we've just not lived boring lives. But, you know, definitely tune into that, because that has its own incredible, you know, transformation journey, and it will help you understand the power of this work and how it doesn't just transform you as a person, it transforms your relationships. And I can't speak to the work as in depth as Di can, because I haven't been doing it for as long, but there's been so many other elements of the work that I've been doing my whole life that I didn't even realise I was doing.
Yes.
And obviously the work she's been doing has transformed our relationship. And that's the thing I think is really interesting, is you can be doing the work yourself and it can still have an impact on the people who aren't necessarily doing the same work. And that's, so important.
And your story, for those of you that are thinking, shall I tune in? Your story is so inspirational to the power of the spirit of life. What you know, it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
When I look at what you, and I think I know it as intimately as anyone outside of you might know it.
Yeah.
Or at least from my perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
And the things that I've seen you walk through so courageously, I just, you know, leave me in awe. And so, like you said, you've been doing this work unknowingly.
Yeah. And I think it's even, this is like a bit of a side note, but, you know, you're talking about, you know my story from your perspective. And it's so interesting because you've had small reflections over the years of how I was when I was at certain points in my life that I was like, I didn't even realise I was like that. Like, you know, some really kind of scary things sometimes where I was just like, I didn't realise I was showing up like that.
Yeah.
Perspective is everything. Like it changes, hearing your perspective on something changes the way I feel about my own story, which is really important. You've been doing this work for how many years now?
8
years.
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about the transformation that you have experienced within yourself. Like, what are the changes that you've noticed in your life, within yourself, as a result of doing this work?
The very first thing I noticed very early on, only months in really, was the confidence that I felt.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I don't think I'd ever tangibly felt that before. And it just felt like a real solidness in me. Like rather than feeling like I was this lightweight, flimsy person, I felt a real solidness in me.
That's really interesting.
So that was one of the first things. And then it's just grown from there. I think the next thing would be the awareness. You know, awareness to me is like, you know, you've got lights on a dimmer switch, and awareness is like turning up the dimmer.
Yeah.
So it's brighter, 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 and you can't become unaware once you become aware.
That's so true.
So it just builds and builds, and it really starts to build the fabric of ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think one of the things I notice so much about what you teach is how firmly rooted everything is in how you feel about yourself and your confidence and your self-image. And like, quick plug, we also have another podcast and YouTube channel called The Confidence Code that we're about to launch, and it is going to be centered around things like self-image and confidence and just who you are as a person. And the reason we wanted to do that was because it is so fundamental to the rest of life. When you are a confident person, you can have good relationships, you can have good work, you can have, you know, good self-care life, like everything around centered around doing life comes from where your confidence is at. And it's incredible that that's actually the change that you started with, was that change in your confidence and your self-image.
And in fact, everyone that does this work says the same.
Yeah, that's true. That's so true. So many of your clients have attested to the fact that doing work with you has just improved the confidence in their life. And then from that, so much else has happened for them.
Yeah.
So now that you are 8 years down the track from doing this work, and you are coaching other people in this work as well with your own framework, which is even more exciting. You've actually taken pieces of your life and what you've learnt and and paired it with what you now know about, doing some of Bob Proctor's work, and you have developed your own like supercharged framework, which is just so cool and so exciting. How do you feel about your life now? So coming back to like square one where we started, how did you feel? We talked about how did you feel as a child and what was your perception of your world and who you were. Now, 8 years down the track from starting this inner work, what's your perception of your life now? What's your perception of yourself? How do you feel now?
Yeah, excited is the first word that comes, because I feel like, or I know that there's so much in me that's looking to be expressed. And so, I'm approaching 60 years old. And a lot of
surely not.
a lot of my friends and people in my age range are talking about retirement. And I have to sort of take a step back and think, oh, I'm not at all there.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just getting started.
Yeah.
And I feel very excited about what I'm here to create and to do.
Yeah.
And and it is interesting because can I do it? Absolutely. Like, there's never a doubt in my mind that I can, and I know how to now.
Yes.
I know, how to shift any blocks that I might be coming up against. I understand the power of desire. There's so many components to this work that builds us into the people that can just live so freely.
That's so
and I
true.
love it. It just complete contrast to where I started.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So the last thing I want to ask you about is your top tier course, which is your Unlearn and Return course. And this is the most of what you offer. There's lots of things that you offer as a coach and so many things that people can do to work with you, but Unlearn and Return is like the everything. It's got all of the stuff that you need to really move forward in your life and make serious progress. Tell me just quickly a little bit about that and how that works.
It's a year long with me, and it really takes you through so many different aspects of you as a person, as a human being, those two concepts or two parts of us, the human part and the being part. And what I love about Unlearn and Return is because it is exactly that. It's helping you to see the parts of you that are, yes, automatic and habitual and that are basically running your life, and understand how to change those, unlearn the things that are no longer serving you, and to return to actually the beautiful you that you were born
That's
as.
so interesting.
Like that, the essence of who you are.
Yeah.
Because when we get into that sort of slipstream, life can only be good. I mean, it's certainly exciting. It's not a boring walk through the tulips sort of thing. But there's growth and there's inspiration, rewards, and like you said, just joy and all of those things. So yes, a year long. And I think the thing I love about the way we deliver what we deliver is that it caters to all sorts of people. So you may not want to be one-on-one in person. You might not want to be on a group call, but you are going to have access to me and the material in a way that suits your where you're at.
Definitely. That's so cool, and that's so necessary in this day and age with such busy lives. We need to be able to access the information and the knowledge in a way that actually suits our lifestyle as well.
And the support,
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So that's the end of our episode of Di's story, and it's such a powerful story and there's so much to glean from it. And we really hope that you would join us for our next episode, which will be, so this is me interviewing Di, and next time Di is going to be interviewing me about my story, and you'll get to hear a bit more of the juicy life that we've lived, particularly my very interesting story, but also how we navigated our relationship together. And it's going to be really, really interesting.
If you are the mother of a daughter, and every mother I speak to just wants to have that beautiful relationship, and that was my heart too. And maybe we went round the long way, I don't know.
We got there eventually.
But we learnt some things that I think you'll find really helpful for where you're at.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you so much for joining us. There's some links in the description for the Unlearn and Return course, and we really hope to see you next time.